All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully everybody has their coffee and their little desserts from lunch, which was delicious. Fabulous to hear from the Congresswoman, as always. My name is Ali Solis, and I have the pleasure of helping to moderate our discussion today, which is on a topic that's sort of near and dear to my heart and to those that care about affordable rents and making sure that we can continue to house and make sure that every person that's living in this country has an ability to be in a home that is affordable. And so to my left is Sarah Sadian. Sarah is the Senior Vice President of Public Policy at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. I've had the pleasure of working with Sarah for a number of years now. She oversees their policy portfolio, as well as their field mobilization and their local campaigns that they run. She's got a decade or more of experience. I think that this bio needs to be updated. I'm like, she's been working a long time on affordable housing policies, and it's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you. And then to her left is Patrick McEnany. Did I get that right, Patrick? I'm practicing. Patrick serves as a development director for a local organization here in Washington, D.C. called the Somerset Development Company. One of the things that I love, I am currently serving as the chair of the National Housing Conference, and one of the things I love about these events is that they are practitioner-focused and informed. In other words, we develop and support policies that we know are working in communities, because ultimately that's what matters to us. And so Patrick is going to talk about his experience specifically working on development projects and new pipeline opportunities as part of his portfolio, as well as public policies and issues that impact the portfolio here in DC. And then finally, rounding out our panel is Sharon Wilson-Janelle. And Sharon, I've also had the pleasure of working with for many years. She is the president of the National Multifamily Housing Council, a 30-year veteran of the housing industry, has had a number of roles both in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors, and runs one of the largest associations in this country that is focusing on multifamily and the importance of providing affordable homes for people in this country. And so I'm excited about this discussion. And today we're going to talk about rent regulations and the impacts on both landlords, renters, and frankly on communities. And I think we've heard a lot about the challenges we're facing as a country with respect to the lack of available affordable housing supply. And while it's been exciting to see that more people are paying attention to this issue, I ran a national public awareness campaign for 5 years just to get people to understand that we have renters in this country, that they are an important part of our economy. And now we're starting to see the issue of housing and the importance of renters showing up on the national stage. And so that's a thrilling and important point, but we're also facing major deficits, an incoming administration who, while supports the importance and the need for expanding the supply of housing, is also facing challenges and a large, robust tax bill that they'd like to advance that's going to be very costly. And so, how we balance these issues while ensuring that we can still have affordable rents so that families can be affordably and sustainably housed is something of great importance to me as well. And we're unsure of the implications of some of the tariff legislation, the immigration changes. David talked a lot about that, but just sort of setting the stage for the context of what we're going to talk about here. I mean, one of the things that I'm excited about, because as someone that has worked in affordable housing sort of development and asset management, there's a lot of regulations that make our jobs really difficult. And if we are going to expand the supply of homes in this country and meet the need, the growing need, then we have to look at that as an issue. On the other hand, we need to balance that with ensuring that there are both funding mechanisms to support the large infrastructure of housing needs that we see. We at NHC believe that everyone deserves access to a home they can afford to meet them at the various stages of their lives. And so while we balance the need for deregulation and smart zoning reform and a lot of the things that we'll talk about here in terms of local zoning, we also have to make sure that there are sound policies that we remember and recognize that there were historic laws in this country that segregated many parts of our population, of our country, of our fellow citizens. And so, how we look at balanced policy in this effort, where I think there's a lot of, we were talking before the panel, Sharon's wearing purple as a sign of her unity. And one of the things that I love about being a houser is that, our issues have been mostly bipartisan. We have different approaches or perhaps different emphasis as we represent individual organizations. But as housers, we band together as often as we can to really push forward bipartisan legislation. And so we're going to talk about some of that today and also some of the challenges. So maybe just laying out some of the groundwork here when we say rent regulation. And I think, narrative and words are really important. By the way, rent control or rent regulation, this has been around for periods of some time. Some people actually look at affordable housing programs in general that have, requirements that are sort of focused on, you get a benefit from the government and therefore you have to serve a certain population. So I think terminology is important and sometimes we get caught up on words, but let's talk a little bit about rent regulation and what we mean by that. So I'll start with Sarah. Rent control policies have become more popular. Why is rent regulation sort of appealing to some of the members that the National Low Income Housing Coalition serves?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, when we think of rent regulation, we usually think of, it can be a broad array of different mechanisms, but we usually think about a limit on the increase of rent or the pace of rent increases, regulations around notifying tenants of rent increases, enforcement mechanisms, and a real specific list of which properties are covered or not covered. And the goal overall is to help prevent displacement among long-term residents. And we certainly see that there's a role for rent regulation, carefully designed when paired with other interventions. But I think it's important to keep the context of when rent regulation can be helpful and when it can't and what the externalities might be. There's really a lot of mixed evidence actually about the impact that it might have on housing supply. The data isn't really universal there, but it's also mixed when it comes to the ability for rent control to create racially integrated and economically integrated communities and to prevent homelessness. So it's not a solution for every problem, but it could fit into this broader category, broader set of solutions. And I think the reason why we're seeing it happen now is for a couple of reasons. One, the housing crisis is worse than ever before. People cannot afford their rent. Homelessness is at its highest level on record. Two, because of the pandemic, I think for a lot of people and a lot of policymakers, sort of the veil was lifted up and they saw maybe for the first time what many low-income renters had been experiencing, which is a lot of largely unregulated landlords who were engaging in predatory behavior, who were raising rents by 40%, even at a time when we were all talking about how being housed was a life and death issue. And I think that fundamentally changed sort of the openness of policymakers to look at rent regulations and other renter protections. And then lastly, I think success breeds more success. So in the last couple of years, 300 renter protections have been enacted or implemented at the local level, not all of them rent regulations, but when advocates see other communities be successful in getting changes made, it inspires them to take it to their own community too. So I think it's a confluence of sort of all of those events coming together.
Thanks so much. And we'll come back to a few of those points that you raised. Sharon, you work with an association of professionally managed owners and operators of multifamily housing. And I think there is a distinction. There are bad actors in every industry. Mm-hmm. The folks that most of us work with every day are doing the best they can to really manage at a time when, as you said, Sarah, we've got just a huge amount of need. And frankly, we have not invested as a nation on the preservation of affordable housing either, right? So some of this housing stock, we need to not only think about the expansion of the supply, but also the importance of preservation. Mm-hmm. So Sharon, talk to us a little bit about some of the concerns your members might have around the idea of probably broadening rent control more broadly, and what are some of the changes or the issues that you're hearing from your members with respect to how that might also further the supply problem that we have?
Yeah, no, I think you did a great job at the beginning of really framing this out as, where are we today? And we are in a situation where, to your point, we have not invested in housing of any sort. not enough housing for the population that we have today, but I also think a lot about the population that we have tomorrow. While multifamily buildings are privately owned, we're building a structure and creating infrastructure for communities that we need to look down the road to renters 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now. And the research shows us that overall, over decades in research around the world and in the United States, that overall rent control policies, and you can talk about any flavor you want of them, hurt the renting population because they limit supply and investment. Because our government has not invested, and we don't live in a socialistic country where housing is provided for people, we rely on private market capital to build the housing that we need. That private investor dollar can go anywhere. It can go invest in Google stock, which is a lot less regulated and has a very nice rate of return. It can invest in Amazon stock, also a nice easy peasy rate of return. Or it can invest in something that we need as a nation, which is housing. And unfortunately, rent regulation policies they create additional risk for investors in out years, as well as immediately, depending on the community. And then they will make another choice on where to invest. We need so much more money in the housing space in order to provide the housing that we need at all levels of income. And I think the other thing too that I think is something we've had some discussion about, but it concerns me a great deal, is because we know the data shows us that, first of all, certainly there are situations where some rent control helps some renters. But who are those renters? Data shows us they are largely white, upper middle income renters. Communities are starting to figure out that if they impose rent regulation or rent control regimes in their communities, they can keep more multifamily housing from being built because the incentives are not there and the opportunities are not there for investors to invest. So we could find ourselves in a position, it's already starting to happen in places in California. You see a little bit of this in Massachusetts where they have fair share planning. The state's taking action against some of the communities there as well, both in California and in Massachusetts, where communities are imposing regulatory schemes, including rent regulation, in an effort to keep people out. And who are those people? Those are largely protected classes. They are largely people of color. They are largely low to moderate income communities. So I think it's a policy that has far-reaching ramifications, and overall, rent control hurts renters. And if we are in the business, especially our members, professionally managed owners and operators, developers and investors, we are in the business of serving customers. Renters are our customers. So if we want to do the right thing by our customers, this is something that we want to push back on and really look at other solutions. And this conference is all about those other solutions. And there are many, many more opportunities that will help us move the housing ball forward. And I am so excited in this upcoming Congress and at the state and local level as well, to work with people on all sides of the aisle to really move that agenda forward.
Thank you so much. So Patrick, you're on the ground, right here in DC. DC is a market where they have existing rent regulation. Tell us your thoughts on how it works from a local developer's perspective and the context around sort of investment and development when you've got rent regulation.
Sure. So for some background about our company, we're a small company based here in the district. We work just in the district in Baltimore with a focus on affordable and mixed income housing. So mostly covenanted affordable housing, Section 8 properties, but we do some market rate housing as well. The district has had a rent control policy for a very long time, going back to the 80s. It's limited in that it's basically just for buildings built before 1975, and it's indexed to inflation. So it's CPI plus 2% is what the increase can be. So as inflation goes up, it's meant to not be a static number over time. There are several provisions in it that are meant to kind of deal with specific cases. One is if the landlord makes a significant investment in the property, or if they have to do some capital repairs, there's some provisions where they can increase beyond that number. If they need to demonstrate they're not making a basic return threshold, that number is fixed, it's just 12%. So if the landlord shows through their data that they're not making a 12% return, they can also claim a waiver exemption. And there's also a voluntary agreement where if 70% of renters together say, actually, we want to see more investment in this property, it's not working well, we can work with the landlord to sign a voluntary petition to raise our rents to actually get more repairs done into the building. And there's also a vacancy exception. If the unit is vacant, you can raise the rents 20% in that case. So there are enough provisions in there that we've not seen a huge impact long-term in DC because we're talking just about the older housing stock. It does not impact the new supply. There have been a lot of discussions in recent years about trying to expand the existing rent control so that it would cover new buildings. And there, I think there is a lot of risk in that if you're not careful with the design of this expansion and how you do it, you can have a pretty dramatic effect on the supply of new housing. And we desperately here in the district need to build a lot of new housing at all income levels.
I want to come back to that issue of, impacts that happen, unintentional impacts of certain regulations and policies that we've learned. But to that end, Sarah and Sharon, maybe you can talk a little bit about past examples of policies that have had mixed degrees of success, some positive, some utter failures, frankly, with respect to rent control. And are there some examples and models of middle ground? So, Patrick just talked about sort of previous regulations here in DC, but do we see any winning solutions? Because that's what we're focused on here at NHC. So whoever wants to take that first.
I don't know that there's a middle ground on rent regulations per se, but I think there is middle ground on creating a package of solutions that work well together. And this is part of, I think, all of our collective challenges as this discussion about rent regulation, while we had a lot of discussion about that at the federal level over the last administration, this is going to move down to states and local levels. And it's really important for us to educate, and that's a lot of the work that I feel like we're doing now, is to say, look, rent regulation is not the answer, but let's point to solutions that are. The state of Florida, as you might recall, in 2023, passed something called the Live Local Act. And the Live Local Act, I think it's a really great example, and we're already seeing it among our members and investors, people that were putting money into states like California, where the question about rent regulation was a little dicey up until recently when California voters unanimously and in a very strong way voted against it, because I think there was a great education campaign around that. But people that were moving investment to Florida because they did three things, and they did them together. One, they put their money where their mouth is. They said, hey, we're going to put over $800 million, almost $1 billion new dollars, into 4 different programs to create more affordability because we know that's what's required. 2, we are going to create a state law that is going to require local jurisdictions to remove local barriers, to increase zoning opportunities, and to do other things at the local level to make housing less expensive and allow us to build more. And 3, we're going to close the door on rent control. There was, Florida had a statewide exemption. There was an exception to that exemption. It had gotten challenged, and they closed the door on rent control. And what that means for investors is I don't have to worry about that risk. Florida's going to put money into it, and they're going to reduce barriers. I'm taking my money, and I'm going to Florida. And that's been a tremendous boon by all measures in a state that has a growing population and really needs more housing development.
Sarah, you talked a little bit about some of the sort of egregious examples, some of the bad actors that we've seen, but talk about some of the positive experiences you see with some of the rent control regulations.
Yeah, and I think this is where the words get complicated and what we're talking about really matters and how it's designed matters. What I think there's definitely a space for, a lot of it depends on how strict are the rent increases and the limit on the pace of rent increases. What buildings are exempted, how long is new construction exempted from those policies. It makes a big difference in terms of the impact. But I think a place where there can be agreement is really in those rent gouging examples of landlords that are not raising rents to keep up with, increased insurance costs and increased other costs that they very legitimately have to address, and that we would want to make sure that all landlords are able to continue to operate. But in those examples where there's just outrageous behavior by landlords, I think that is a place where there could be some agreement. And all of the things that Sharon mentioned are all things that we support: more housing supply, reforming zoning restrictions, increased rental assistance. But all of that's going to take a very long time to actually reach the renter on the ground. And something like anti-rent gouging measures can help keep them stabilized in place as part of other expansions, as part of other interventions. But it can play a really important role that I don't want to overlook.
If I can just add to that too, I think part of the confusion really lies in, and I think you and I completely agree on this, that there ultimately increasing housing supply is going to be the answer to creating a market where renters have choices and they can have those housing opportunities at different times in their lives at the price point they need them when they need them. There's great research out of Tokyo. They have their occupancy rate in apartments is about 88%. You know, we're back up here at the 90s now. That, I'm not saying that's the right answer for our industry, but they have multiple opportunities for people on an ongoing basis. So regulating on the front end, when you're always going to have that exception, and it's not going to keep pace, adds cost to operations. Our research that we've done with the National Association of Home Builders shows that 40.6 cents of every dollar of development goes to regulatory compliance. So as we create a regulatory scheme that makes it complicated to get through these wickets, you're adding more costs on the back end, and all renters pay for that.
And I think that goes to like a fundamental maybe disagreement about the underlying causes of the housing crisis. Supply is certainly a major piece of it. The gap between incomes and housing costs is another piece of it.
Yep.
I think we would say this power imbalance between landlords and renters is also something that contributes to housing instability and homelessness. And earlier this year, we published a National Tenants Bill of Rights where we engaged with tenant leaders across the country. And they told us overwhelmingly that that relationship between landlords and renters has a huge impact on their quality of life and their ability to stay stably housed. And rent regulations could be one piece of it, but there's a broader set of renter protections that are needed to ensure that there isn't discrimination, there isn't harassment, that people have access to fair lease terms, that their homes are habitable. And I think we need to see rent regulation as a larger piece of this power imbalance between landlords and renters.
Go ahead, Pat.
If I could add one thing that we've noticed with kind of local trends on rent control policies. So recently, 2 of the neighboring jurisdictions here, Montgomery County, Maryland, and Prince George's County, Maryland, have both passed their own versions of rent control. And one thing that I think is very notable, so generally they're trying to follow what DC does of have some level of indexation to inflation, but they do have a cap overall that you cannot raise the rents past 6% in a given year. I think that was essentially following what DC had done during the pandemic. The thing that I would be most worried about with having a set cap is it doesn't account for the economic realities on the ground. We just lived through a horrible period of inflation, and you can certainly point to some bad actors who are taking advantage of it, right. But it was also an incredibly tough time to be a landlord and be a developer. We've seen insurance costs go through the roof. I know there's a separate panel today about insurance, but that is a crisis with no end in sight because the economic impact of climate change is going to be channeled through the insurance markets long term, and they're going haywire, and that's very hard to manage as a landlord. So we're seeing insurance costs go well past that 6% range. Another thing that doesn't get a lot of attention is that we had a huge crisis in property management and staffing. Mm-hmm. That property managers were the industry that lost one of the most jobs during the pandemic and had the slowest recovery. And so people left the job. It was a tough job. They didn't want to do it. They moved to other sectors. And hiring folks has been really tough. And the way you do that, of course, is you raise their wages to try and attract the best and the brightest. But as a result, we're seeing incredible pressure on our operating expenses. And so it can sound very easy to say, okay, well, whatever we do to say don't raise rents past 6%, but what if my costs have just gone up 10%?
Well, and I'll add another one to that, and this is something of a sleeper issue, but it's really critically important. State and local taxes. State and local taxes are between 10 and 20% of rent. When you don't have control if you're a homeowner, you get a separate tax bill. So I pay my mortgage, I pay my insurance as a separate bill, and I pay my state and local taxes as a separate bill. When you are a renter, you pay for the services for your streets, your water, your fire department through your rent. So that's a completely uncontrollable cost. Post-COVID, state and local taxes in many jurisdictions have gone through the roof for all the good reasons. Teachers need to be paid more, firemen need to be paid more, there was work to be done. But when you put an artificial cap, even an index for inflation cap, it doesn't account for the local jurisdiction to being able to go ahead and raise our state and local taxes. So I say this to local officials all the time. I'm like, okay, if you'd like to have some kind of rent regulation, some kind of cap, even a soft cap, well, you agree to not increase your taxes, at least to that, you at least contribute to that, and you'll never get that commitment. So
But there are some examples of tax abatement and other ways to do that. But
in
yes, I hear
exchange
you.
on a voluntary
Correct.
basis, in exchange for, and that's where you mitigate the risk.
Right.
If in exchange, and we're doing a lot of work around tax abatement, we think that's a great tool. But the owner and the investor going in know, okay, this is the income I need to provide for this period of time. I will receive a tax abatement of X, Y, Z. But just in the private market space, without that assurance, any kind of cap is going to make it very difficult to get that investment that you need and to assure that you can make the investments over time.
The challenge with those voluntary agreements is that, of course, the worst actors are the ones who aren't going to voluntarily participate in those programs. And I think we have to be able to distinguish between the landlords that are in this room that are doing their best job and really want to serve the public. And there are landlords, especially private equity landlords, that have a business model that's based on junk fees, raising rents as much as possible, squeezing their tenants. They're not mom and pop landlords who are really trying to do their best. They are using a business model that's based on how can they evict as many tenants as possible and churn through tenants. And I think we need to, where I think landlords and industry groups can do a better job is not pretending that all landlords are the same and that everyone's sort of behaving under the same set of rules, and really to work with advocates to stop the worst actors and really try to put some limits on where we're seeing egregious and predatory behavior.
And we completely agree that we should be policing our own, and there are egregious examples. However, I don't agree with the distinction that it's, private equity landlords versus mom and pop landlords are all good. Matthew Desmond wrote a book called Evicted. What was it about? It was about predatory practices among mom and pop landlords. It was not about professionally managed housing where you have guardrails from investors. You have more and more guardrails from shareholders in some cases. So I don't think that that's the distinction we want to make. We want to make the distinction around who is operating in accordance with state and local law, where much of this is already being taken care of.
But I do think there's somewhere where we can go farther by educating, by creating better partnerships, by creating, and we've seen this already, leadership within the private sector that stood up and said, these are the ways that we are working with our tenants. We are meeting with our tenants who are our clients. We want to understand what their needs are, and developing programs and recommendations in addition to rent control, which I know we're focused on here today. So I think we've got room to grow in that area, but I do think there are some solutions where we're starting to see really the focus where it should be, which is on renters, but to your point, Patrick, on also making sure that we can pay our bills. I mean, you're developers, even though you're providing a product and a service, you still have bills to pay and rising cost. And to that end, we've seen a series of what I'll call consequences that come with good intentions. The pandemic was a record-breaking time, uncharted territory for many of us. We were all arguing for and continue to argue for the need for rental assistance. Programs were created, and we were at a time when you had to reduce regulations or oversight, and so I'd like to hear from you a little bit about some of those challenges in terms of not the immediate need to get the resources out, but long-term implications of what we learned from the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. And as we think about a new administration, crises continue to come, whether they are COVID or climate-related or other issues. How should we be thinking about creating new policies and learning from either mistakes of the past? So say a little bit about your experience with ERAP and what it means for you today in this environment.
Sure. So the reality is the DC affordable housing industry is in a moment of absolute crisis. We have an incredible surge of people not paying rent that is threatening to drive 22,000 of the district's 48,000 covenanted affordable housing units into foreclosure. And what that means is about $450 million that the district has invested as second mortgages, construction loans to support affordable housing could get wiped off the books, all of that lost, and then you'll have a massive displacement crisis that the likes of we've never seen before in the city. And we already have affordable housing developers who are starting to go out of business and more likely on the way. And the reason for this is, early on in the pandemic, we were actively partnering to help get emergency rental assistance out the door. We were knocking on tenants' doors December 2020, helping them sign the paperwork to get their first rent relief as a Christmas present. It was an exciting moment for all of us where we were working together. But what we found is that year after year, every round of emergency rental assistance that came our delinquencies would just bounce back faster and more furious. So we are now operating with 3 times the level of delinquency that we had before the pandemic. And we're actually one of the folks who are doing pretty well. We don't have a lot of properties facing risk of foreclosure. There's a large national property management firm called Wynn Companies who manages a lot of affordable housing properties around the country. They say DC is 2% of their units and 28% of their unpaid rent. And the reason is because we tied here in DC long-term, not just temporary getting out the emergency rental assistance out the door, but we tied it to permanent eviction reforms. That if you ever applied for emergency rental assistance long-term and you had a pending application, you could stay your eviction case indefinitely. And it created, absolutely, as any economist would warn, a horrible scenario of moral hazard where folks learned if you don't pay your rent, there's a good chance the government will step in to pay it. We also got rid of documentation requirements, so you didn't have to prove you had an actual income loss or an emergency bill. You just had to self-certify and say you needed rent money. And if you then applied for the rent money, you could block an eviction indefinitely. And that has created a horrible perfect storm that is leading us straight into a foreclosure crisis. So I think it's a great example of how well-intentioned policy can really have these absolutely destabilizing effects. When it comes to eviction, we don't want to evict. We are mission-driven landlords. We want to help keep people housed. We want to avoid it wherever possible. But the reality is, as a landlord, it's also the only tool you have to control and police your properties. And when that gets completely taken away from you, things can spiral out of control very quickly. And it happened not just with us on rent, it happened with crime as well. We spent a long time pushing out organized crime from our buildings when we took properties over. And we saw them come creeping back during the pandemic. And it's been a lot of work now with local police forces and others to try and get those criminal elements back out of our properties. It's tough, but eviction is an important tool to help do that when you have bad actors.
Great, thanks for that. What does this mean for future development? As we're thinking about, an opportunity perhaps with a new administration who's excited to see the expansion. We have actually bipartisan legislation that all of us have worked on in terms of the expansion of the housing credit and continue to advocate for expansion of rental assistance as we know it today, traditional programs, not necessarily like the ERAP, which was emergency funding. But what does this mean for the future development? And we can talk about sort of the implications for some of the smaller landlords. But to your point, we've been really talking about expanding supply, but we've got a real challenge of losing the affordable housing stock that we have for a whole host of reasons, not, including what we just talked about with respect to, and DC, I would say, we're here, it's our home, and so we see it, but it's an issue. I serve on the Eden Housing Board. We've had to write off millions of dollars, right? And this is an organization who is deeply dedicated to meeting the needs of the lowest income families. And so, we learned a lot, and we want to, learn from the mistakes of the past. And by the way, foreclosure is not the panacea for a developer either. It's costly. And if you're a mission-based organization who's in the business of doing this, it's the last thing you want to do. But there needs to be some mitigated steps, right? Some ways to help. And what are things that we should be thinking about as we look to the future?
I'll take at least part of that. It was something you said earlier, and Sarah, you said this too. Education. The DC group of affordable providers did an amazing job knocking on doors, going from the judge's chambers to the AG's office to the DC council to the mayor's office, back in a circle to social services. This went on for 2.5 years to get people to understand that the implication of the bad policy that they purviewed was spiraling and undermining the very thing they were trying to do. But it took 2.5 years for the DC council finally to say, okay, we get it, and just made the change just a couple months ago. So it's communication, but it's also communication. I want to get back to your comment about power imbalance. And frankly, that's on a lot of folks that have provided housing over time. We have not done a good job always of communicating not just to policymakers, but communicating directly to the customers and saying, hey, here's why this provision is in your lease. Let's be really clear about how transparent we're being with you so you understand it. And I think there's a lot of room for all of us to grow in that communication side. And I'm hopeful that we work on that part, because that's ultimately where we're going to have success, and not try to be so reactive with rent regulation policies and other things that are ultimately going to hurt more than they're going to help.
I was going to say, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense to me too. I think a lot of this is also coming from deep distrust of landlords, and part of that I think can be resolved by some landlord groups, emission-based landlord groups, other landlords who want to, not always saying no to renter protections, right? When the alternative that landlords are providing is unbridled, completely unregulated housing market where landlords can do whatever they want, that's only going to fuel renters to be even more effective at organizing and bringing more people to their fold. So if you are wanting to prevent rent regulation, I'd say it might be time for a shift too of thinking about, well, what are the places where we can work with tenant leaders to put in place reasonable rent protections that don't compromise your ability to operate properties, but also show that you're not dismissing any renter protections that might be needed to prevent egregious predatory behavior, right? And I think what we end up seeing sometimes is the landlord groups are the groups that say no to everything. And I don't think that's really tenable going forward. I think it really just fuels this distrust that's sort of underlying the conversation about rent regulation.
And just dovetailing on that, by the same token, we're not in a completely unregulated rental market. Correct. There are state and local laws that govern the relationship between rental housing customers and the owners. So there are things. We again, getting back to communication, I think it's really important for all of us to be in the business of being sure residents know what their rights and responsibilities are as residents, and owners to know what their rights and responsibilities are as owners. So it really is a two-way street, and I think, in fact, even just the term tenant protections, which is what has been called sort of generically, implies that the customers that owners serve or rental property providers serve like the customer needs to be protected from their service provider, and I don't think that's accurate. So we really need to talk about this in a different way, that this is a contract between two parties, and how do we be sure everybody understands what those roles and responsibilities are?
I think that's right. Go ahead.
Some tenants really do need to be protected from their landlords. And I think it's helpful to think about, for example, in some states you can evict people with just a few days' notice, right? Why are we protecting landlords' ability to evict tenants in 3 days? That's outrageous. I hope everyone in this room can agree that that's not sufficient for people to find new housing, move their items out into a new place. It sets them up for long-term housing instability and, in worst cases, homelessness. And that's a place where I think there needs to be a willingness to come to the table in a more open manner to say, okay, most landlords are doing fine work, but there are some landlords who the laws are put in place to protect and to allow them to engage in really deeply unfair practices. And it might be legal, but it's not good for the tenant, and it's not good for the community to have more people being evicted with such little notice. And that's an expense we all have to take on when we're paying for homeless systems and we're paying for other social services because the landlord chose to evict so quickly, right?
So I think
that's one example.
I think there are really good examples on both sides in the areas of we can see where, to your point, really egregious activities. And I would say, by the way, we have laws on the books. We do have protections. They need to be better enforced in local communities.
Absolutely.
We need to be lifting up those bad actors. They need to be held accountable and, penalized like you would do on a fair housing case or anything else, right? In order to protect the overall system, which we care deeply about. We have work to do, which Sharon has said, about better educating and understanding our shared responsibilities in the space, whether you are a renter or a landlord. And I think organizations like ours and others can help do that. The other thing is identifying solutions. 3 days may be egregious, so what is the right model? Let's identify some models that have some carrots and some sticks, some things that are working, some incentives for long-term affordability, and as a result, you get some tax breaks. Maybe you get some, support for eviction counseling or other resources that you can go to support tenants that find themselves in challenges. So I think what we should do, we could spend a lot of time talking about the single one or two examples. And I would say we have work to do for sure, but I have seen the industry working together. COVID helped force some of that, frankly. We had to figure out a way to do some things to work together, but we still have a ways to go. And I would, argue that given the times we're facing with just potential federal budget cuts, one of the reasons that I really got involved in National Housing Conference is that for too long, the housing organizations would go to our silos, hunker down, protect our space, and not work together. And we are at a detriment as an institute, as our individual institutions and as an ecosystem if we start to do that now. We have to be finding those solutions, lifting them up, and finding places that we can work more closely together. So Patrick, I wanted to come back to you just about any recommendations you have, just given the experience that you learned living through this ERAP process, and Sharon mentioned in DC they've changed some of those policies now so that you can't use the eviction process, or sort of make it impossible to actually evict people that have willfully violated their contracts or can pay and aren't paying, those egregious on the other side. Any thoughts you have in terms of recommendations if you were going to redo this differently going forward?
Certainly, you're talking about emergency rental systems,
right?
Specifically. Mm-hmm. The biggest mistake DC made was in 2021 when they were lifting our local eviction moratorium. And still at the time, there was a sense that we had a lot of federal money. The federal government actually clawed back unspent money from other states and was giving it to DC because they'd passed out so much money successfully that we really had to, there's still a race in 2021 to get as much money out the door as possible. And so that stay that was meant to be a temporary feature in 2021 was, if you apply for this rental assistance, you can stay your eviction indefinitely. It just got left in place. And so here we are 3 years later. And there is, the pandemic has subsided, unemployment is back down to normal levels. There was no reason to be keeping a lot of these emergency policies in place for so long when they were quickly driving our sector into financial ruin. And so it was well-intentioned. We did a lot of experimentation, but I think this has very much been a wake-up call in the district that we need to recognize that some of these policies failed, and some things that are appropriate for very emergency situations are not appropriate long-term. And you have to find a way to really restore the social contract. That's what we're talking about. I consider this kind of one of the last great aftershocks of the pandemic. We had inflation aftershock, we had a crime aftershock, and this was just a breakdown in the social contract. And it's going to take us a very long time to repair that level of trust between landlords and tenants. And it's really just down to the individual building basis of us going and talking to our residents and trying to rebuild those relationships. But we have to have basic rules in place that we can enforce. Otherwise, you basically create anarchy, and that's never going to serve our housing sector well long term.
So communication and improving that sort of relationship between the landlord and tenant is certainly something that I think we can all work on together. Are there other ways to bridge this nexus that's being felt between residents and property managers?
Wages.
Wages.
I think that's something we have to look at. There's been a lot of confusion in the data and about, rents have far outpaced wage inflation since COVID. When you look at the data, that's not exactly true. At the upper level of higher income renters and middle income renters, wages have far outpaced increases in rent. In fact, in some of the national data, at those income levels, the rent to income ratio is the lowest it's ever been. The problem is down here at the low to moderate income level. And we need targeted solutions to that group and really look at why their wages have not kept pace with true costs. And proposals like rent regulation and those kinds of things are more of like these global solutions that don't target the problem where the problem is. And it's right down here and we can see it in the data. So I would really hope that we focus our time and attention, as Patrick mentioned and Sarah mentioned, on if we're going to have some kind of interim rent subsidy for people, that we target it at the people that it needs to be targeted to, and that we ensure that it gets paid to the housing provider so we don't have these kinds of problems that we've had in the district and other communities across the country where there has been some churning of that money that has not kept people necessarily housed.
And I couldn't agree more. We absolutely have to target our housing solutions to people who have the greatest needs, and far too often the solutions aren't reaching them. And I think we'll have the biggest test of that next year when Congress looks at a tax bill that could potentially include investments in the low-income housing tax credit. But we could also see really devastating cuts to HUD's budget, to rental assistance, to the home program, which is used to drive down affordability within tax credit units. And that will be the first test for you landlords and industry groups in this room. Are you using your political leverage to defend those programs, or are you going to keep, yeah, we like rental assistance, but you're not really going to put the political capital that's needed to save it? And I'll also say we see that on the more positive side, there's always talks about a bipartisan housing package, but mostly we're talking about tweaks to existing programs. And what we really need is the messenger here to be the landlord groups, to be the industry groups who say, that's not sufficient. That's not gonna actually solve our housing crisis. We need to expand rental assistance to everyone who's eligible. We need to have much greater investments in affordable housing, especially deeply affordable housing. And we'll see how that plays out next year. I have a feeling that we might be on the side of really trying to defend. We're spending so much of our time defensively next year. Will you join with us in trying to protect those programs? Because we really need an allyship between all of us to make sure that we're keeping those programs whole.
Well, I can speak to NHC's role, which is constantly be about supporting the expansion of the supply of rental homes and making sure we've got adequate, rental assistance to meet the need that's out there. And I think I've seen that with NMHC as well. This isn't just tweaks. We're looking at a major expansion, finally, hopefully, for the low-income housing tax credit, which we all desperately need. We've made tweaks to make it easier, hopefully, to serve more deeply low-income and moderate-income families there. We need to continue to be creative with financing and lifting up those solutions that are working.
I think Sarah's reading off part of our legislative advocacy agenda. So.
Yeah, good. There you go. I think we're actually, oftentimes I find that we're more unified than we are apart, right? It's, but it is these times that do cause us to scatter and go, and focus on our little preservation of one program. And I think that's something I hear you and agree with you on. Some questions that we've gotten from folks that are viewing us online. Patrick, many affordable housing providers report their rent arrearages have skyrocketed. You mentioned that as well, since rent relief really ran out. Are you experiencing that? And if so, how is your organization coping with some of the financial burden?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the name of the game right now to be an affordable housing developer in the district is survive. The question is, will you be able to keep going as an entity when you're facing kind of financial ruin? As I said, we're doing much better than a lot of other folks in the business who are staring down a long wave of foreclosures. The other thing I would mention that's really important is in the district, what we've done is repurposed our entire housing production trust fund, which is what gives construction loans to support new affordable housing production preservation projects. We've now repurposed that entire $80 million for this year to bail out properties at risk of foreclosure. So now we're kind of in a twofold dilemma. Not only are we trying to stop this foreclosure crisis, we have ground our entire pipeline of production and preservation projects to a halt. And most affordable housing developers make their money on a straight fee basis on new projects. Similar to the architect or the contractor, you make a developer fee project by project, and that's what keeps you going. So not only are we suddenly not seeing the rent coming in to help keep our properties afloat, we've also now lost our entire income stream going forward from new projects. And the district won't be able to start any new production or preservation projects for several years. So it's really a double whammy. We have to get off this hamster wheel of bailout after bailout after bailout because it's not working.
Well, just to build on that, another comment, I'm not sure there's a question here, but a California example from a landlord in the Bay Area saw their pandemic gas rates costs went up by 98%, their water was up by 65%, garbage was up by 128%, insurance up is another 30%, while rent increases were limited to 3% annually. So there needs to be some kind of balance, even in those places. This is an example where I think you have rent control and yet the costs are rising at such extraordinarily high levels. How do we find that balance, right? And I would add, maybe we need some kind of emergency assistance for landlords as well, right, during these unprecedented periods of inflation and other issues. Let's see, another question. What guardrails can we include in any past rent regulation measures if they come through state or local laws? Are there any guardrails? And then is the desire for rent control, is that desire regardless of whether you agree with it or not? How can we make sure any damage is mitigated? So any guardrails that can be passed for those places that are looking at rent regulation?
Yeah, I think providing some flexibility over, not providing a hard cap, but thinking about flexibly about how do you allow landlords to raise rents in response to higher costs, but to keep that within a reasonable amount, and making sure we're exempting new construction for a certain period of time, I think those are the sort of controls that can help mitigate it. And there is, to go back to my earlier point at the very beginning, like there is mixed evidence. It really depends on how you design it. You could create a rent control program that's far too restrictive and has these externalities, or you can design it in a way that's a little bit more flexible, can keep people stably housed, and doesn't have an impact on supply. So it really depends on sort of how are we carefully designing it, and are we pairing a rent regulation with greater investments in supply and rental assistance and other sort of interventions that are needed more globally.
And agreed, in theory, that makes a lot of sense. The two states where we've seen that happen most recently have been in California and Oregon, and both of them, now that we have data over a period of time, are losing production relative to population increase. So we're seeing investors saying, I don't want to take that risk, I'm going to go somewhere else. So while in theory that makes some sense, in practice it hasn't panned out in terms of growing the supply, which we all know we need.
The next question is around the issue of utilities and rising costs. So developers, specifically nonprofit developers, have choices to make about utilities, sub-metering, and individual meters for units. How do we address rising rents due to utilities and the high cost of building out utilities?
Well, I think you mentioned there's an earlier comment, which is very important, which was utilities were another huge surge in cost over the last few years. When more people are staying at home, people are using the bathroom more, they're using more electricity. And so we saw a huge surge in 2020 of our utility bills, especially for water, right? Because you generally pay water for the whole building. I think there's a very good opportunity for us to look at smart technologies with careful implementation, where you're properly incentivizing folks to conserve electricity, to conserve water through good structures of sub-metering and then billing back. For the LIHTC program, for example, you do a utility allowance. So you have to estimate out how much a tenant will pay in their electricity or their gas, or depending on the jurisdiction, and their water, and you would subtract that from the overall rent. And what's good about that system is that then folks are still paying their own bills, and they're responsible for understanding the incentive structure. And at the same time, you're also guaranteeing that it's not just another big added cost for these dedicated affordable housing programs, that it's still designed, that they're still capped at that overall affordability level. So I do think it's very important that we generally want to encourage and incentivize tenants to pay these bills themselves. We think it's a better system than just the landlord covers it for everyone, because then you have a better alignment of incentives long term.
And there's some education that needs to happen there, right? So if people have, by the way, renters aren't only living in multifamily apartments, they're living in single family homes, a large share of them. And so, and not every one of those is some of them have to pay for their own trash or other things. So it's not a one size fits all for renters, and that's good, because we want to have options for people to be able to choose from. To that end, around sort of technology, a lot of my clients are using technology as a way to improve resident services and how they connect with residents and are responsive to resident needs, whether it's the boiler breaking in their unit or what have you. How are we thinking about technology as an asset, either to help control costs, that education for folks on what they can do, simple things to drive costs down, which then would make it easier to not have to raise rents? Are there ways that you're thinking about technology as a potential tool, right, to help in these efforts?
This is something our organization has been long invested in for more than 20 years. We do a conference every year called OpTech, which really is both a marketplace of ideas and a marketplace of products around that intersection of real estate and technology. And we've seen this move light years, and much of it is increasingly client-facing. It includes positive rent reporting provisions, information for particularly low to moderate income residents about how to gain financial rental assistance when they need it. There's really a lot of opportunity. Some of the products effectively guarantee rent for gig workers, another important opportunity as well. So some of them are inward facing to help reduce costs for the operators, but increasingly there's a lot that's outward facing. We've recently created a sister organization called the Real Estate Technology and Transformation Center, RETC. And RETC is really bringing together housing providers, but also technology companies that are serving those housing operators, so we can speak from an advocacy platform with one voice, instead of trying to get bifurcated in this transaction, being sure we're all talking together, because that technology is moving so fast. Sometimes the operator doesn't even know what's going on over here until that product is done and a technology company's trying to sell it to them. Better that we all start talking about this sooner so we can create that environment so that innovation can continue to happen. Ultimately, that is going to help us. This much, and at what point in time, and I can see the difference between how my parents use technology, how I use technology, and how my 20-year-old children use technology, and probably how kids in kindergarten are using technology today. So that's all going to shift over time, but that is going to be one path for us. It's not the ultimate path, but it is one path forward.
So someone mentioned that a lot of the focus has been on ensuring that the system works for landlords, but we have families, people, really struggling in this country. We've heard a lot about that today. Not making enough, the wages are not sufficient to cover all these rising costs. And, that's at the end of the day, we are here to try to support those families and ensure that they have housing that is affordable, and make sure that housing, as described here, can be, seen as the human need that it is. And I know that those sitting here all believe that, housing is foundational for help people to have a healthy, thriving life. Are there more things we can be doing to drive awareness and attention on the needs of families that are really struggling? We learned that from this past election. There are people that feel like their voices aren't being heard. So what are ways that we can do to make sure we don't lose focus on those families?
I think part of it is expanding the conversation. We absolutely have to talk about supply, but it feels like we haven't done enough to really talk about how we address people's incomes being too low through rental assistance or other tools. And so I think creating some space for that is important. I think there's also new opportunities that we could look at, things like a fully refundable renter's tax credit that could be something that's included in the tax code that puts dollars directly into the hands of renters. It could be based on their cost burdens, or it could be measured as a comparison to fair market rent, but something that's really getting at people's wages aren't going to increase enough through their work. People are working. They're just not getting paid nearly enough to afford housing. And we need a broader conversation about, are there new innovative ways that we can be addressing that in addition to housing supply and preservation?
I think that's a really good point. And in the last 2 minutes, I'd love some closing remarks. We know there's going to be a major tax package that's likely going to move through reconciliation. We know that there's some existing programs that many of us in this room are really fighting for. You mentioned a renter's tax credit as a potential new tool. Are there other things we should be thinking about that will not make it easier to build more and also make it easier for those lower income working families to maybe get a tax credit or a tax break like a lot of people that own their homes do through the mortgage interest deduction? Are there some better balanced approaches we could be looking at through tax policy?
It seems like the best opportunity, or maybe the one that's primed to be most likely, is an expansion of the low-income housing tax credit, which would be great to see. We'd also love to see reforms to make it easier to serve extremely low-income households, to build more deeply affordable units. If we're only building supply at 60% of AMI, or we're only addressing zoning changes to build more market rate housing, both important things, but if that's all we're doing, we're not really getting at the underlying cause of the housing crisis, which is the shortage for extremely low-income people. And so that's one place where I'd encourage Congress is looking at LIHTC, just make sure that those reform pieces are included too alongside expansion.
I'll again, can we just get this LIHTC bill done, please? We've all been playing around with this for so long. Also working on a workforce housing tax credit, which another critical part of this ecosystem is that people in that sort of moderate place are getting priced out of the LIHTC program. And the Section 8 program and everything else. So really important that we continue to increase that volume. And then something else that we're working at that isn't necessarily a federal tax issue. There's a whole host of federal tax incentives that do help bring that investment into housing, and we're going to be looking at preserving as many of those as we can, and even enhancing those if we can to get more housing, get more money in housing. But we're playing around with this idea of, again, creating a federal incentive for local tax abatement. We know that local tax abatement is a way to create not just new units, but also to preserve existing units at an affordable level. That can happen. To put more money into, if there's a local tax abatement, you can leverage, in many cases, the resources to reinvest. So we think that's a really important tool. Could the federal government be a player by matching, by providing resources to help the states and localities create the tax system that will be more useful?
I should say we're certainly very supportive and hopeful of a lot of these tax initiatives. One thing I would like to mention that I think doesn't get a lot of focus, and of course there's not a lot that many of us can do about it, but is monetary policy. At the end of the day, the housing crisis has been largely driven by monetary policy. We had a giant housing crash, as we all remember, 2006, 2008. We had a decade of incredibly low interest rates, which really helped to inflate asset prices long term. And then we had a period of incredibly low interest rates, which instantly caused this surge in housing prices. And we're in a new paradigm moment, right? That era of low interest rates is over. It's painful. It's going to be a very tough adjustment, especially as developers. We like to have low interest rates so we can get loans, so we can build more. But I think we need to accept that the era of low interest rates is over. It's not coming back. That's going to help long term on the demand side in terms of getting prices back under control. But it's going to be a very big long-term adjustment, and we're really into a new era of pre-2008 monetary policy again.
Well, let's hope that with a new administration, some excitement about the need to extend supply, some better solutions on how we can improve relationships between landlords and tenants, some tax policies and incentives, carrots and sticks to help us on both sides. We'll continue to try to chip away at this problem and lift up solutions that are working on the ground. So please join me in giving our panelists a big round of applause. And I'm to announce that we have a now 14-minute and 30-second break until the next group comes on. So thank you all.
Thank you. Can I get this? Thank you, everyone. So as Ali said, we're going to take we'll give you 15 minutes. We'll give you the 30 seconds back. For our final breakout sessions, we'll begin at 2:30 p.m. The panel, The Case for Updates, Modernizing Federal Housing Programs, will take place here in the ballroom. And the panel on Homelessness as a Health Crisis, Finding Solutions in a Post-Grants Pass Landscape, will take place in the MWL rooms, which are located on the opposite side of the lobby. Thank you.